Tonight, we are talking about slow motion, how to shoot it on your camera, but then also how to like get into the computer, do the editing to actually slow down the footage. And for this, of course, I needed a brand new skateboard, so we're gonna use this to help us. Ba-boom! I made the very unfortunate mistake of turning the camera around because I needed some place for the skateboard. But I forgot the walls look like urine yellow. Anyway, let's talk about slow motion. What is it? Well, normal speed motion, you're typically at 24 to 30 frames per second. All frames per second means is how many individual photos or frames do you have per second. Fairly straightforward. What we need for slow motion is we need to get more frames per second so that we can take basically what would normally be a minute-long clip and drag it out without it looking like really slow and jittery. Like, I could just slow this down right now, but I didn't shoot that in slow motion, and so it looks like really choppy. Anyway, what we want to do is have that buttery smooth and looking good. So in order to be able to do that, you need some kind of camera, like a cheap Canon, or a fancy Panasonic GH5 that can shoot at least 60 frames per second. That's kind of the minimum entry point into slow motion. This Canon SL2 shoots 60 frames per second at full 1080p. Some older cameras, you're only going to get 60 frames per second at 720p, which is going to not be quite as good of quality. Or super fancy cameras like this one will shoot 180 frames per second at full 1080p or 60 frames per second at 4K. So a bit of a beast, but let's just talk very simply about a camera that probably a lot more people have. 60 frames per second. So normally I shoot at 24 frames per second. So all my regular speed footage, when I'm into the menu and you go into your video shooting settings, here I've got 23.98, just round up to 24. It's fine if that's what you're seeing here. If I want to shoot slow motion, what I have to do is I have to go up to the highest one, which in this case is 59.94, 60 frames per second. I go okay, and now I'm ready to go. Everything that I shoot now will be shot in slow motion, even though it may not look like it. We're gonna tackle that a little bit later. And when you're done shooting slow motion, put it back to what you normally will, or else it'll look funny. So when I'm done, I go back to 23.98. Now, if you're at 30 frames per second, that's fine. Just check whatever you normally shoot at and go up to basically the highest mode. Shoot your stuff. When you're done shooting it, putting back to what you normally shoot in. Okay? It's really honestly that simple. The magic comes afterwards when we step up to the computer. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm now going to do a couple things on my skateboard. I'm going to shoot on 3 different cameras. This one shoots 60 frames per second. This one shoots 120 frames per second. And this one shoots 180 frames per second. And then I'm going to show you how to slow it down in a couple different editing programs. And that'll be that. You'll be ready to shoot slow motion. Okay? Oh yeah, quick note before we move on. Light. You need a lot more light to shoot in slow motion. That's why if you've ever shot like slow-mo on your phone indoors, it just looks horrible. It's because you need a lot more light. If you normally shoot at 30 frames per second and you're shooting at 60 frames per second slow motion, you need twice as much light because you're grabbing twice as many frames. In the case of this, if you normally shot at 30 frames per second and you want to shoot at 180 frames per second, you need 6 times as much light. Okay, so if you're a manual video shooter, you're shooting in all manual settings, remember, double your shutter rate. So if you're shooting at 60 frames per second, it needs to be at 1/125th. If you don't shoot in manual settings, don't worry about it. Just know the more light that you give your camera, the better that slow motion is going to look. So outdoors is great. In this case, I'm going to have a couple of lights to help brighten things up in here to try and make it look as good as possible. Okay. All right, I know what you're thinking, moron. That is not slowed down footage. 1, not nice to call people morons. 2, yes, we're going to have to slow it down in post or in editing here, which we are going to do momentarily. But first we have to do just a little bit of math. And I'm sorry, there's some math involved here, but we have to know how much we're slowing it down. Like what percentage slow do we want it? But it's very, very easy. Take what you normally shoot in. If it was 30 frames per second, you punch in 30. And then you go divided by what your slow motion speed is. So 60 frames per second. If that's the fastest your camera shoots, 30 divided by 60, 0.5, 50%. That's what speed you're going to set it to, is 50%. In my case, I shoot at 24 frames per second. And on this Sony camera, I can shoot at 120 frames per second. So I go 24 divided by 120, 0.2, 20%. That's the motion. So just take whatever you normally shoot at, divide it by the fastest that you can shoot at. That gives you the percentage that you're aiming for, or what is the slowest slow motion that you can do. Okay, well, we'll go through that again in a second. Anytime, if you just have a question, if that's not clear, if that didn't make sense, just drop a comment below. I'd be happy to answer to it. Okay, here we go. All right, so I've already brought in the files here, and we've got our first clip. This is from my Canon. This was shot at 60 frames per second. When we play it back, yeah, it just looks, fairly normal. But because I'm always in 24 frames per second, I can slow this down, and I go 24 divided by 60, that equals 40. All I do is I click on my clip here in Final Cut, I go to the speed, and I go to custom, and I go 40%. Hit enter, watch what happens here. Oh, it's in slow motion. Now, okay, not a good kickflip. My toe is touching basically right here, but just so you know, I have a 2-year-old who's been puking all evening. I didn't care too much about getting a perfect kickflip. I just want to get this video out. Okay. So here we go. That was 24 frames per second, versus 60 frames per second. You can see it's a lot slower, and especially when I'm dragging here. You can see we've got lots of slow motion to be able to play with. Let's go over to Premiere. I'll show you how to do it there. Again, we've got our clip here. We play it back. It looks normal speed. It looks a bit weird because it was actually shot at 120 frames per second. And in Premiere, just right-click. You go speed duration. Now again, this is 120 frames per second, and I want to basically make it work for 24 frames per second. 24 divided by 120, 20%. So here we go. Speed, 20%. Enter, and watch what happens. Oh, beautiful, buttery smooth slow motion. Showing off a disgusting kickflip. Now, the Panasonic itself, the files that come out of it, actually already come in slow motion, and that's just the way that Panasonic does their high frame rates. Not every camera's like that. Most of them work more so like this, but that's just something to be aware of if you're shooting. But if you have a GH5 and you'll figure that out. But let's just watch them kind of back to back now. So here we've got the Canon at 60 frames per second, slowed down to 24 frames per second, which is 40%. Next up, we've got the Sony, and this was at 120 frames per second, again, slowed down to 20%. Takes a little bit longer. And now we've got the Panasonic GH5 shooting at 180 frames per second. That's actually 13% when you bring it back to 24 frames per second. And the only thing I might note is that it's not as clean as the Sony is. And that's just the nature of going that high of frame rate. It's tough on a camera, plus the shutter speed has to be a lot higher. It can't let in as much light. There's a little bit more noise. It is what it is. But it's all very, very cool and neat to be able to do that. And this is just a really gimmicky example with a skateboard doing a kickflip. If you've seen any of my other videos when I'm shooting, the cinematic B-roll, or look at a guy like Peter McKinnon, there's so many people out there, slow motion adds a whole other element to your videos that can make them really, really interesting. So, guys, if you want, try that out. Drop a comment below. Let me know how it's working for you. If you have any questions, I'm Justin. I'd love if you subscribed. If you're watching this somehow through search, you found it. Or smash that like button. Because some reason on YouTube, we all smash like buttons. Makes no sense. Anyway, I'm going to edit this video and go to bed.